Saturday, May the 4th, 1968, the bat mitzvah of Amy Weinrib. And now I would like to ask Amy Weinrib to come to the bima so that I can present her with this Bible on behalf of the women's division of our society. Come close. I have a very clear recollection of you, Amy, I think at the age of 6. And when I look at you today, and especially when I hear the verve and vigor with which you polish off the Haftarah, upstaging everybody on the bima, I see how much you've changed since you were 6. Do you remember when you were 6?
No.
I feel a little like singing that song from Fiddler on the Roof, "Is This the Little Girl I Carried?" Except I didn't carry you, but I did eat latkes with you once. Do you remember when you were about 6 or 7?
No.
Your mother may remember. It was one of those times when we used to have those parties from the Hebrew school before Hanukkah, and we used to have coming back? Mama, do you remember? You remember? And that was a long time ago, and you've been with us at school, and it's been a pleasure. Half your teachers, myself, and I know Cantor Nathanson feels very good this morning to see the way you've grown and developed. Amy Weinrib at 13 is a different Amy Weinrib from Amy Weinrib at 6, and we hope you will continue to progress and grow in spirit and mind, every possible point of view in years to come. And symbolic of this, I'm giving you a book which, in a sense, we Reconstructionists describe as the 6-year-old of the Jewish people, the childhood diary of the Jewish people. It is a little book. It's a young book. It was written when Israel was a child. And in many respects, it contains certain unformulated ideas not fully developed and ideas not fully matured. And it is just symbolic of a part of what we mean by Judaism. A lot came afterwards. Judaism at 13 was quite different from Judaism at 6, and Judaism at 113, you should live that long, wasn't what it was at the age of 13. We talk here of Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, and by that we mean that in every age we have always respected the past, but we have used the past as a foundation on which to build in the present so that we can move through creatively to the future. And I hope you will be with us, you and your family, especially you, Amy, for many years to come, to participate in an ongoing process of learning more about Amy Weinrib and more about the childhood diary of the Jewish people and more about what our synagogue and what Judaism stands for. And I hope you will approach all the problems that will come your way in your future life in the same spirit that you attacked the Haftarah this morning. Mazel tov.
Thank you very much.
Go back and here's your Bible. And shake hands with Cantor Nathanson, and I'd like to ask the family to stand. Any grandparents here this morning? You're also responsible. May he who blessed our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless Amy Weinrib, who has this day been called to the reading of the Torah in token of her desire to live a worthy Jewish life. May God, who was with her from birth and enabled her to grow to her present stature in body and spirit, continue to be with her in the life that is before her. May it be God's will that she continue to grow in health and strength, in wisdom and humility, in love and loyalty, in faith and courage, that she may ever be a joy to her parents, an honor to her people, a credit to her country, and a true servant of God. Amen. Please join me in reciting the Shehecheyanu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehecheyanu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Amen. Will the congregation please rise for Kedusha on page 186. Our English reading this morning is on page 165, page 165 in the prayer book. A prayer which normally the Rabbi reads, but this morning I'm going to ask you to join me in reading this prayer. It's been lying around the prayer book for a long time, and we haven't used it for a long time because many of us have been very unhappy about what has been happening in our country and with our government and with our president. Now, of course, the president named in the prayer doesn't mean particularly the individual human being who occupies that office. It means the office as well as the man. Suddenly, this weekend, a prayer which has been lying around in the lumber room of the prayer book for so many months and years takes on a new and added significance. It wasn't only the stock market which leaped yesterday, albeit momentarily, when it was announced that peace meetings would take place shortly in Paris. I think all our hearts went up a few points, and hopefully they stayed there. We Jews, many thousands of years ago, discovered the concept of shalom, peace. But it was easy for us to discover the concept of shalom, which means peace, and it was easy for us to preach it. Because in the ancient world, we were not a great power. We didn't have any atom bombs. We didn't have any tanks. We were a small people, about as big as the state of New Jersey, and tucked away in the Middle East between two great big powers. On our left, Egypt, and on our right, Babylon. And when you're a little guy, and you have a big guy on your left and another big guy on your right, and you get squashed in the middle, you learn to say shalom very quickly. So it was easy for us to be among the first in history to understand how important shalom was. Is it always going to be the case that only the little guys are going to learn the meaning of shalom and the big guys never? Is it always going to be the case that the small, defenseless, and helpless people will be those who will always try to implement, those very people who can't do anything tangible about peace, who will pray for peace, and those who have the power and the capacity to do something for peace, who withdraw, become indifferent, apathetic, or find all sorts of complications as to why nothing should be done for peace? Many of us were getting very worried, for after all, it had been said that we would go anywhere, anytime, any place to discuss peace. And yet every time another place was mentioned, that wasn't good and this wasn't good. Now, I know that the right is not on the other side entirely, but nor is the right on our side entirely. It takes two to make a war. It takes two to battle. It takes two to fight. And there are wrongs on our side too. And I say to ourselves, to the United States, we speak from a position of such power as the world has not yet known. We are so powerful that our power spills over. We don't know what to do with it. And that is part of the reason why we find ourselves in trouble. We feel we have to interfere and meddle with everything that is going on in the world. We who speak from a position of such infinite power, one of the greatest countries and the greatest forces that history has ever known, ought to be able to make a few concessions, a few compromises, a few gestures, without slitting our throats, without making our future existence intolerable. Someone has got to make a move. Someone has got to make a gesture. Some actions must be forthcoming from these discussions. I do not say that we should weaken ourselves or that we should expose ourselves. But if we are the ones who are to make a gesture in the direction of peace, and a tangible gesture in the direction of peace, and that gesture or those gestures are flippantly rejected by the other side, then the world will know that we wanted peace, and we strove for peace, and we pursued peace, and were rejected. In recent months and years, the name of America in the world, in the free world, not just in the world behind the Iron Curtain and under totalitarian regimes, has been a reproach. We now have it within our possibility to remove, to wipe away that reproach. It may well be that we will make a gesture for peace, and the other side will not accept it, or they will try to use it for their own nefarious purposes. That may be. we must be morally in the clear. We must take the first step. And therefore, this prayer for our country in the bottom of page 165 suddenly assumes a new meaning for me, and I know for you. And I want you to pour into it this morning as we read it together some of our own resolve, for the way we conduct our personal lives also has a subtle and profound effect on the kind of families, communities, cities, and societies in which we live. We pray for peace. Peace not with dishonor, but peace with honor. We pray for a strong country, self-confident enough to know its worth and its power, with the ability to stretch out a gesture, a helping hand, a hand stretched out towards peace. Let us read at the bottom of page 165 together. Lord of the universe, we invoke thy blessing upon our country, upon the government of this republic, the President of these United States, and upon all who exercise just and rightful authority. Do thou instruct them out of thy law, that they may administer all affairs of state in justice and equity, that peace and security, happiness and prosperity, right and freedom may forever abide in our midst. Unite in loyal and loving accord all the inhabitants of our country, so that men of all races and creeds may find in their common citizenship the bond of true brotherhood. Banish all hatred and bigotry, and safeguard the ideals and free institutions which are our country's pride and glory. May this land, under thy providence, be an influence for good throughout the world, uniting men in peace and freedom, and helping to fulfill the vision that inspired seers. Neither shall men learn war any more. Amen. I suppose this week will go down in the history of New York City, if not the history of any other city, as the week of Columbia. I was in the florist yesterday afternoon getting some flowers for Shabbat, and the florist said, "What's happening to this city? It's going to the dogs. Isn't it terrible? Look at those students every day. Columbia, Columbia, Columbia." So we had a chat, and we came to the conclusion that if there were another country in the world which were better than this one, we'd think of going, but we couldn't find one. So we decided that with all its defects, America is an outstanding country with its defects. It was Winston Churchill who said that democracy is the worst form of government, but he doesn't know anyone that's any better. And when you think of what happens in other countries in the world, behind the Iron Curtain, Greece, Yugoslavia, Hungary, France even, when student riots take place, we're just going to have to make an allowance for a small and modest amount of police brutality. Because if you have a police force, you're going to have a few brutal policemen. I find a few brutal people in every society. And I don't think we can hold it against the police force as a whole that a few unfortunate incidents happen. I think we should look upon this as remarkable that within such a short time, the leaders of our community were prepared to bring those people who had violated the sacred trust of wearing a policeman's uniform to book. So show us another country in the world which will tolerate this kind of thing and take it in a fairly good spirit. And they waited a long time before they called the police in. And after all, you don't get students of that caliber and strength and vigor to move by saying, "Now come along, gentlemen, pass along, please." With all her faults, America has great potential and great reality. But why did this have to happen? Why were our papers full of this day after day this week? And why was there so much hatred? My God, some of the things that the students said when they were dragged out. Some of the things that were heard by people who stood by, some of the things that were reported in the papers. the quintessence of hatred. There is so much hatred in the hearts of some of these young men and women. They hate. I think one of the reasons for this type of unrest in Columbia, and the kind of unrest we are having on campuses throughout the country and have had for some years now, is a wild and extravagant and barbaric reaction on the part of the students against depersonalization. The punch card syndrome, the IBM syndrome. It started at Berkeley, and I think part of the reason for what happened in Columbia this week was the same thing. A reaction against the depersonal quality of modern college education in this country. The Reconstructionist movement is sponsoring a rabbinical college, and I have had the privilege to be present at some of the sessions when students are being interviewed for acceptance into this college. It's going to be associated with Temple University. It will involve the students taking a PhD course. Students will have to be registered independently at Temple for their doctorates, and then they will be able to participate in the Reconstructionist Foundation's Rabbinical College to train as Reconstructionist rabbis. There's a very wonderful ecumenical religious faculty at Temple, and the hopes look extremely promising for the future of this college. But I was shocked in the course of these interviews when each student had a dossier or a file to see the way in which the progress of the student in modern academic life is recorded. They looked like Sears Roebuck's bill of sales. They looked like hieroglyphics. The whole thing was so over-systematized that you looked at the student and you looked at the report and you felt that somehow the student was being diminished by having his qualities, his attributes, and his learning and what he had done and what he was reduced to little holes in cards, because the way the progress reports were formulated were to make it easier, not for the student, nor even for the teacher, but for the computer. And the students looked smaller after one read the reports. There was a living human being of flesh and blood with hopes, with aspirations, with feelings and emotions sitting there, and a brilliant university administration in all its wisdom had tried to reduce the quintessence of what that young man or woman stood for in a series of little holes or information which could very easily be put into the shape of a hole or a square on an IBM card. Have you ever had an argument with a computer? Because I have. I'm very particular about my name being written A-L-A-N. I don't know why, but it's all I've got. As a matter of fact, there are about 50 Alan Millers in Manhattan anyway, so it's hard enough to be an individual as it is. And when it's spelled A-L-L-A-N or A-E-E-N, I get excited. Doesn't take a lot to get me excited anyway, but I get excited about this. So I once wrote to one big credit card combine, I won't mention any names. Would they please write my name properly? Oh, by the way, put the zip code on properly too, because sometimes, after all, it was very private. I didn't want the other 49 Alan Millers in Manhattan to know I owed this company $49.50. It's my business, not theirs. I must have written my request on my note paper, on synagogue note paper, on the actual IBM card, at Gornish geholfen. So one week I cut little holes just where it says, do not bend or mutilate in any way. And I got a prompt telephone call the next Monday from a man who said he was in charge of complaints. So this is a piece of advice I would like to proffer to all of you who ever have a fight with a computer. And it can be very simple. If they just happen to charge you $3 too much, you'll never write it off, wipe it off your record, because computers don't answer letters. They just repeat. And the people who open these letters apparently are not trained to read. It's too much trouble to read today. Just throw it in the machine and let the chips fall where they may. Now, please do not think that I am a snob if I bring up the fact that I was educated at Oxford, because I don't mean to be a snob by talking about it, but The kind of education we had there was so radically different from what I see these young people having to go through today that I just sympathize with them for not throwing bombs. We didn't have any of these punch cards, and the kind of reports that we had were minimal. The evaluation which took place within a context where there were enough students around for a professor to cope with, so that there could be some human relationship, that when somebody wanted to know, how is so-and-so doing? I happened to be on scholarship, and the people who paid for my scholarship was an external body, and every year they had to have a report on what I was doing. And my tutor at Oxford had to write a longhand letter personally to describe my progress. He didn't just push a button somewhere and then have some anonymous secretary translate little holes into easy slogans which could be just as much applied to anybody else as anybody else. But the individual at college is a human being. He is fundamentally and radically different from anybody else. How can you possibly compare people, except insofar as you degrade them and minimize their essential and quintessential personality? Now, I'm not saying that I didn't have many complaints to make against the University of Oxford, but never at any stage did I ever come across any student on the campus who felt that he was a cipher the way students at modern colleges feel that they were ciphers. And we may laugh on the educational methods of the past and think we're terribly slick if we introduce all the newfangled attributes into our modern programming at colleges and what have you, but we are taking away something invaluable, the essential humanity of our students. And I think the very presence of a computer on a college does something to the minds of the students. And I don't know how we can solve this problem. We may have to decentralize the whole college system. We may have to have, instead of a multiversity, colleges which are as big as a relatively small building, dormitories, governed by small independent groups with a great deal of freedom. Maybe instead of having talks about decentralizing schools, we better start talking about decentralizing the colleges, because something is happening when you put students in a complex of hundreds of thousands of other students. They don't feel they are human beings, and you cannot educate automata. You have to feel human to want to be educated in a truly human fashion. EDP, electronic data processing, has recently, according to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency bulletin, been introduced into synagogues. I don't know what to make of this, but it is most of all used in Reform congregations, hardly at all used in conservative congregations, and not at all used in Orthodox congregations. I can derive no theological conclusions at this stage from this sequence. Why is EDP being introduced into synagogues? The answer given by those congregations that are using it is that it makes for prompt billing. And they say, when you send out prompt bills, the congregation pays the bills quicker. It does something to a man in the congregation if he gets regularly, every first of the month, a reminder that he hasn't paid for his theater tickets, his Haggadah, his tickets for the High Holy Days, he hasn't paid up all his membership, and so on and so forth. And it elicits the money from the people, so you can keep a synagogue running. The executive director just presses a button on Monday morning, and all sorts of things start whirring in the ark, and before you know where you are, everybody is billed promptly within 24 hours. In addition, those who use the EDP claim, you can plan better. You can feed into the machine in little squares and holes and what have you, how many children you have in a congregation, how many parents you have in a congregation, how many grandparents you have in a congregation, how many widows you have in a congregation, how many divorcees you have in a congregation, how many healthy people you have in a congregation, how many sick people, and you can plan for the future. All you have to do, instead of having an education committee meeting, is you push a button, and you can see that most people don't like this or like that, because attendance was like this and attendance was like that. I had a better fantasy even than those who use the computer in this fashion. They suggest, by the way, that where you have half a dozen synagogues in one area, they should all band together because it's cheaper. And then you can, reduce your rates, like hopefully Con Edison does. I've never seen it, but it's supposed to. If things get easier, I had a terrible fantasy that congregants who came to shul would be wired for pulse beat and blood pressure during the service. After all, we want to plan, we want to know what their likes and dislikes are. We would know exactly response to the reading of the law, to the bat mitzvah, to the sermon, to the singing of Adon Olam. And therefore, somehow by pressing a button, we would know not what the congregation ought to be like, but what the congregation is like. And then, of course, the Board of Trustees will have to determine whether to feed existing needs or try to elicit new needs. Pastoral calls would be made much better by a machine than by a fallible and imperfect rabbi who occasionally forgets. It would all be done by little punch holes. All the hospitals would be geared so that if any member of a congregation entered a hospital, a ticker would start moving and something would register back in the computer at the synagogue, and this would be fed into the central file, and immediately the telephone would ring in the home or the bedside of the person who was sick. This is a recording. The rabbi and the chairman and the board of trustees at their last meeting learned with regret of your recent illness. In view of the size of your contribution to the Yom Kippur appeal, in view of your regularity of attendance at synagogue services, in view of your regularity in attending meetings of committees to which you have been delegated, the board passed a resolution wishing you a speedy recovery. The vote was 25-14. I knew a rabbi who had a book which he kept on his desk, and in that book he had entered over a rabbinical career of 35 years every fact and every piece of information he could get from members of his congregation, and he tabulated it all. He had a wonderful secretary. And when anybody telephoned him, he'd say, Mrs. X? Oh, yes, Mrs. X, tell me, how's Jimmy's appendectomy scar? Jimmy was operated on when he was 8 years old, and now he's a grandfather, but all the facts are there. And you know, there are some congregants who say, my God, what a wonderful rabbi. If he can remember that my son had an operation 50 years ago, I'll vote for him when his contract is renewed. And that's pretty good. A rabbi had all the information. Frankly, I think if I'd been the congregant, as Feldtepus, I'd have felt that maybe there's something wrong. He's not doing anything else with his time except concentrating on recollections, like some people swallow cricket and baseball scores. All he can remember is dates of operations. Frankly, I think I'd like the rabbi to forget about my operations. I like to remember it in health, not in sickness. Perhaps a synagogue should be as big as a rabbi's head. I mean that a rabbi should be able to know approximately by face, if not always immediately by name, what his congregants look like. Of course, that is to say that assuming they present themselves to him occasionally. A rabbi, unlike an elephant, should have the right to forget occasionally. You know, a lady in this congregation once complained to me bitterly after Yom Kippur one year, when we have the whole synagogue full, that I hadn't missed her. She said, Rabbi, I'm very upset. She came back the week after. I was away for Yom Kippur and you didn't miss me. You know, where there is no forgetting, there is no real memory. It's like having good food. Good food is food that can go bad. The kind of bread that is treated with all these chemical additives can stay fresh for 10 years, but who needs it? It tastes like that. I was very mad at this lady. I controlled myself, which was an effort. But months later, I said to myself, thank God, a synagogue, she was right. A synagogue is a place where somebody should feel the right of going and telling the rabbi that she's angry because she was missed because she wasn't there on Yom Kippur, that she was with her daughter on Long Island. Where else in modern society can you do that sort of thing? At Lincoln Center? In Central Park on your favorite bench? Nobody cares today. Thank God there's one place left where you can say to the rabbi, I wasn't in shul for Yom Kippur and you missed me. It's one of the last places today. And thank God there's a place left where people can write the kind of letters of complaint that get prompt replies. I once wrote a long letter of complaint to the CBS because they put what I thought was a very, very bad program on Russia, which could only have exacerbated and aggravated international tensions. That was about 18 months ago, and I'm still waiting for a reply. Something happened in Central Park on the day of the Martin Luther King Memorial, something that the Archbishop of New York did, and I thought it was lacking in taste, and I wrote to him. It was a perfectly respectable letter. It began, Your Excellence. I had my secretary check how you speak to an archbishop. And that was about 6 weeks ago, and I'm still waiting for a reply. There is a crudity in institutions which only acknowledge plaudits, but fail to acknowledge, however modestly, the criticisms which arise legitimately in the course of the year's activities. A university should be big enough for the personal touch. And we have in Columbia a manifestation of what happened in Berkeley. Punch card pupils rising against the golem of the computer. Now, in marriage counseling, as a rabbi, I find that the reasons why a young or a middle-aged or an old couple are having difficulties, when they're old, they've normally learned to live with them, but certainly in the earlier stage of marriage, the reasons why people say they are bickering with each other and quarreling with each other and having difficulties with each other are never what they say they are. The visible or manifest subjects about which they quarrel always lead to more subterranean, which, as it were, the others are a front for. I think the overt reasons which the students at Columbia gave for their aggravation, the gymnasium, lack of participation, were not the real reasons for this outburst. If they hadn't felt the way they did before these problems cropped up, the whole thing could have been tackled differently. If you happen to be in a crowded subway and you step on a man's toe hard and he yowls, and you say you're sorry, and he says, "Why don't you look where you're going?" You don't say anything because you know he's been hurt. If he's a saint, he may say, "Oh, that's all right, that's all right." But if he pulls out an 8-inch knife and digs it in your belly, you'll wonder what he was hating about before you happen to have the misfortune to tread on his toe. He was carrying an awful lot inside him before you elicited this response of an 8-inch knife. Why was the hatred at Columbia so profound before this broke out? The answer is that you cannot reduce students to ciphers without making them as anguished as wild animals waiting for an occasion to burst out of their confines. And secondly, I believe the outburst at Columbia was part of the irony of the Spock generation. And this is an irony which Dr. Spock himself probably did nothing to bring about. He is now in the forefront of trying to stop the war and make the country a better place, and yet there is an irony that a generation raised on permissiveness quoted Spock as the Bible. And these children who are rebelling are largely Spock's creation. Ah, yes, people say, but Spock doesn't say you should let your children get away with murder. I know he doesn't. I've read him. He is a Shulchan Aruch in our home also. But you know, Reconstructionism doesn't say many of the things that people claim that it says. There are only, unfortunately, too many Jews who see in the profound reconstruction of the Reconstructionist attitude towards God, atheism, and in the remarkable attitude of the Reconstructionist movement to the concept of mitzvah or folkway, a total indifference and apathy to Jewish mitzvah or religious ritual behavior, and in the concept of the Jewish people as developed by Reconstructionism, see only a form of atheistic secularism. I'm not surprised that Dr. Spock was misunderstood. If he was only misunderstood half as much as Mordecai Kaplan has been misunderstood, he's doing very well. Nevertheless, as in Reconstructionism, so with Dr. Spockism, people do tend to get what they are looking for. If a parent wants a rationale for being totally permissive and refusing to lay down any kind of system and discipline for children, you can find it in Dr. Spock. Just as if you're looking for atheism, if you look hard enough, you'll find one or two sentences which can be pulled out of context in Reconstructionism. 2 books were recently published: Robert Rosenthal's Experimenter Effects in Behavioral Research and the Social Nature of Psychological Research by Neil Friedman. And they conclusively and devastatingly demonstrate that up to now, all that material on which we've been asked to change our patterns of living from psychological testing and so on has proved unfounded in this respect, that all the statistics elicited by psychologists in their data have possessed one variable which was totally uncontrolled. And that variable, according to these 2 books, is what the experimenter expected to happen in the course of the exercise and experiment. What these 2 books show is that the results that the scientist expects to get are more likely to occur than any other kind of result, which rather puts paid to a lot of our myths arising out of statistics. By the same token, parents went to Dr. Spock's book and got what they wanted. The way people go to shul and get what they want, and the way people go to college looking for what they want. It is said that sometimes children in a nursery who are beating everything up say, "Wouldn't it be lovely if someone could come and tell us to stop doing all this?" They'd feel better somehow if there was a line beyond which they couldn't go. And Some of those young men and women who rebelled at Columbia this week are among those few of the last generation, and perhaps they are not so few, who never really had a good smack bottom, who needed discipline, who needed to hate their fathers at the right time, in the right place, and to learn to cope with that hatred under the parental roof, to experience hatred of elder parental figures or parental surrogates as the other side of the coin of love, to learn in the home that our emotional being grows out of love and hate, that it is the human condition. But on the Columbia campus, it is too late to learn what should have been learned 15 to 20 years ago. But Columbia appeared like a family scene this week. The same kind of thing, reduced to a small level, is what often happens in homes. It used to happen in my home, my father trying to crawl under the bed to pull me out with some kind of a clothes hanger. Police brutality? Come. Have you never seen parental brutality? Norman Mailer is not the only one who ever behaved violently at home, believe me. And many a parent, where everything that he said and did were taken down in evidence against him, would have a hard time convincing any jury that he was a good, kind, and gentle and sweet parent. I think we all should hold up our hands here and say guilty. Let us turn to our Torah, not for guidance, as much as for helpful insights. We read this week in the Torah about leprosy. When a house suffers from the plague of leprosy, when a man suffers from the plague of leprosy, in ancient days the Bible instructed our ancestors to go to the priest. The house had to be destroyed, the human had to be purified. From a modern point of view, this is all ridiculous, for leprosy is a disease. And what has priestly authority to do with the curing of a disease? Well, of course, our ancestors didn't have a cure for leprosy. I'm not so sure we have a cure today. But they had leprosy, and they had no cure. So they tried to cope with it. They tried to live with it. They gave that sickness of leprosy a moral meaning. They read mitzorah, which is the Hebrew word for leprosy, to mean motzi shem ra, to slander. A man who suffers from leprosy, they claimed, suffers from a psychosomatic disease, which is what happens when you slander people. Like what they say today, if you smoke too many cigarettes, you'll get cancer of the mouth. So also, if you talk too much about other people unjustly, the rabbis say, you'll get leprous. And then, having made leprosy a moral sickness, they then try to alleviate the inner reactions of the patient by giving them guilt feelings. You see, they couldn't get rid of leprosy, so they tried to help people to live with it. And they felt, rightly or wrongly, that if you made a leper feel that he had become leprous because he was wicked, then he'd try to repent. Well, maybe he wouldn't get better, but he could always say to himself, well, I haven't repented enough. That was easy. So he'd still have some urge or will to survive. It's not so stupid. I've heard psychiatrists today telling me about people who have incurable mental diseases, acute homosexuality, acute forms of difficulties in interpersonal relationships. And cure in such circumstances is not to remove the disease, because the disease cannot be removed. A great cure is performed when the man with the sickness is enabled to live with his problem. That is a tremendous advance. A man who thought he was an outcast, a moral leper, le mot juste, a moral leper, is made to feel that he has a right to be a human being and a right to live in society, and he shouldn't be ashamed of himself and crawl along with his head sunk into the ground. And to be able to make a person who is suffering from some kind of a mental or psychological or interpersonal disorder to feel that way is an enormous advantage to the one suffering. And that's what the ancient rabbis tried to do with leprosy. There's a deep insight here, that there will always be situations in life that can only be controlled with authority. There are certain things that cannot be removed. And the psychoanalytical relationship is a perfect example of an authoritative situation in which great alleviation can often be brought to the individual suffering from a species of leprosy. We live in a democracy, but I think the big mistake we and the parents of Columbia students, some of them, not all of them, and we ourselves make as parents, we make a great mistake. We live in a democracy, and we assume, therefore, that every institution in a democracy has to be democratic. That's not true. It's a great myth, and it has to be exploded. The family is not a democracy. The sheer stupidity of expecting young children to have a vote equal with mother or father. It's absolute stupidity and arrant nonsense. And yet I have heard and witnessed and seen some parents who pride themselves with their daughter of 10 or 11. I always let her do what she wants. By the way, this is normally vis-a-vis leaving Hebrew school early, or not doing something they ought to do. When it comes to going out with a 45-year-old Negro who smokes pot, they don't say, I always leave it to her. They have second thoughts. But even to think or to say this in front of a child is ludicrous from an educational point of view. I always let my daughter do what she wants. That is as stupid as 13, at 14, at 15, or 16. I'm not going to give an outer limit. The parent should try as hard as he can to hold on. You'll know when the child no longer wants to listen. And until that time, the family isn't a democracy. Until that time, the father and the mother have to set an example and insist on certain patterns of behavior. And any parent who thinks there is some conflict between a parent saying no, because I say so, up to the point where you can get away with it, conceded. And democracy had better study a little about family life and about democracy also. The school is not a democracy. I will not tolerate the nonsense and stupidity of having 9 and 10-year-old children telling their teachers what should be in the curriculum, or even students on the campus. A boy or a girl of 19 and 20 is in no fit state mentally, intellectually, or spiritually to decide what he or she should be told. I would concede that there are certain areas in university life where there should be participation on the part of the students. In our Hebrew school, one of the great contributions that Dr. Feinstein made to our school has been the introduction of a student council. A student council which is democratically elected once a year. Each class votes for a class representative, and that class representative meets regularly with the school principal at a student council, and there certain items are placed on the agenda which, in the opinion of the rabbi and the principal, are suitable for student involvement. But we do not put on the agenda how late students can come to school, or how many times they can be absent during the year. We did put on recently, what kind of program would you like for Purim? And so the beggars decided to write a Purim play for the faculty and the rabbi to perform. And we went along with it. And that is democracy. And that is involvement. That does give them a feeling that they can do something. But you have to draw a line between what they can and what they can't do. And in the drawing of these lines, the parental figures play a supremely important role. Now at college, I would say that students should have an involvement in the hours when they should or should not be in girls' rooms, if they are male, or female for that matter. And they should have a role in determining certain aspects of university life, but not in planning the curriculum. If a university cannot plan the kind of curriculum suitable for the student has the freedom in a democracy to opt and go to another college where he will find something more to his liking. And when other colleges see that colleges with avant-garde, new, reconstructed thinking curricula attract more and better pupils, then they will also change their mode of living. College is not a democracy any more than the family. The army is not a democracy. You know the story of my friend in the British Navy who went to Israel during the early years of the founding of the state and visited one of the two Israeli ships. And when he got back, they asked him how he liked the Israeli Navy. And he said, it was fine, but there's one thing he couldn't make out. And don't forget, the British Navy has a ruthless tradition of immediate obedience. He said, there's one thing I couldn't understand, this former commander of the British Navy. When an Israeli officer in the Israeli Navy shouted an order to one of the ratings, the rating said, Rega, wait a minute. And of course he found that a little difficult to countenance. The army and the navy are not democracies. And even in democratic government itself, we elect men to positions of authority, which they are then meant to exercise. American democracy is not Swiss democracy. We don't have a system where every 5 minutes, alle Montag und Donnerstag, somebody can say, let's have a referendum. That is destructive to the democratic process. You don't have a show of hands alle Montag und Donnerstag every 5 seconds. That is infantile. And those who believe that democracy is always a precise ascertaining of what the people feel at a given second don't understand the first thing about democracy. And perhaps the Gallup polls do more harm than we know. More harm than we know in trying to put a finger on the immediate pulse of the collectivity. Because it takes time before the will of the people can be formulated. People may feel one thing on Monday, and they may feel differently on Thursday. And the democratic process precisely has been geared by wiser men to make allowances for time. You're angry on Monday. On Thursday you've calmed down. On Tuesday you may feel black, but on Thursday it may be white. Time has to be given. In Britain, a parliament is elected democratically. But once it has a majority, it stays there for 5 years. And in America, a president is elected for 4 years. And if he justifies the hopes that the country placed in him, and he feels he can carry the country with him, then he has authority and shouldn't, except in exceptional circumstances, be put off his balance by the whims and caprices of an ongoing every day to day, every second change in the wind. The Vietnam War was the exception that proves the rule. There are other issues where this does apply. We need controlled authority. Authority which is answerable ultimately to the sovereign body, which is the people, but not every hour or every minute, because we grow through authority. And all of us regress from time to time, in moments of stress and moments of sorrow. We don't need discussion and debate. We need a firm helping hand of a father surrogate or a father figure. We need discipline in youth, and to some extent also among our student body. And what happened in Colombia stems from a society which tacitly encouraged parents to let their children have a summer hill. Authoritarianism can be a curse. The Nazi Party in Germany, according to John Slauson in a letter to the New York Times this week, a very important letter, I thought, we didn't re-educate the Germans after the war because the grounds and the basis of Nazism is in the authoritarian pattern of the German family. And until the Germans can do something about the authoritarian pattern of their family, which is hyper-authoritarian, there is going to be a tendency in German politics towards the Führer figure, towards Nazism. But by the same token, as much as too much authoritarianism can be a curse, too little authoritarianism can also be a curse. Negat Sara'at, the Bible tells us this morning, when a man has a plague, he should be brought to the priest. In sickness, we need doctors, not discussion. In ignorance, we need teachers. And in certain types of rebellion, we need discipline. If the authority figures in our society are degraded beyond the point where they can function effectively, the losers are our children and ourselves. It so happens that my deepest sympathies are with the pupils, not so much for their stated reasons, but for the reasons that I have analyzed behind those stated reasons. Their depersonalization and the lack of discipline in their childhood, for which I cannot even blame the parents. Our newly married and young parents must be taught to trust their basic instincts as fathers and mothers, and to stop reading the slop that comes out each week in the New York Times on how to rear children, mutually contradictory and self-negating week after week. And most parents read it with trembling hands and they don't know what to do. Throw the magazine away and give your child a schmeiß toches. He will grow up the better for it and you'll sleep better at night time. We must all try to have a little more confidence in those whom, within the strict confines of democratic procedure and control, we elect democratically to exercise rightful authority. And we expect them to exercise rightful authority and not to look over their shoulders all the time at Gallup polls or cheap magazine articles in the New York Times. Without a little more discipline, without a little more self-control, but also without a great deal more personal concern for the individual human being, the plague of leprosy which threatens the walls of our society may seriously weaken their very structure. It is good to live in a society where these problems can be brought out into the open and not allowed to fester in the dark. But let each and every one of us participate in their wholesome and creative solution. Amen.